In a previous video, we worked on an example where we had two pieces of known data. We knew the speed of light and we knew a particular number of days. And then based on those two pieces of information, we were then able to display to the user how far light would travel in that number of days just by doing a fairly simple calculation and then outputting it to the web page, which was then rendered in the browser. This is the page that we were working on right here. And in the browser, it looks like it's working just fine. That was a fine example as it is, but it is not especially interesting, I suppose, or terribly helpful. Something that would make it much more interesting and potentially much more helpful would be if the user actually had the ability to select the number of days. Right now, the number of days is hard-coded into the program as a literal right here. What I would like to be able to do is to set it up so that the user has the ability to choose a number of days, fundamentally whatever number of days they would like. The way I envision having this set up would be there would be a page where the user in their browser would get a series of options or a form which they could then use to choose a number of days, and then that information would then be used to perform the calculation and show the user the output the way the script is working right now. I've already started another page. This is it right here. I called it Days Links for the moment. Right now there's no PHP in the page anywhere, but let's take a look at what might be necessary in order to give the user the ability to choose the number of days. To start off very simply, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a set of PHP tags, and in those PHP tags I'm going to define a days variable and I'm going to set it to some value. I'll just set it to 1. I think I'm also then going to put in a hyperlink that will take me over to my Lightspeed page. The basic idea being that I would like for the user to visit this page, which would then create the days variable. That for the moment is standing in for us actually allowing the user to pick the number of days themselves. And then once they've visited this page and then had that variable set, they could then click the link, go over to the Lightspeed page, and see the calculation based on that. In order for that to work, I'm going to go back to the Lightspeed page and I am going to comment out where I'm creating the number of days there. So in essence, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create the days variable on the first page the user visits and then access that days variable on the second page that the user visits. Let's see if that works. If I jump over to my browser and pull up my new page, this is what it looks like right now. Since I visited that page, we should know that the days variable was created, and when I click the link then to go to the Lightspeed page, well, it hasn't worked. I get a notice telling me that I have an undefined variable called days. It happens when I actually try to use the days variable in the calculation above the HTML code. And it happens again down inside the body of the HTML code when I try to actually access the value of the days variable. I am still getting my output. In days, light will travel 0 miles. The actual value of days is missing, and obviously the calculation for the distance that light travels is not working correctly. So what's gone wrong? Why did that not work? Well, the easy way of explaining that would simply be to say it doesn't work that way in PHP. But if you want a little bit better of an explanation than that, what you have to do is you have to go back and think of the running of these two pages as they fall into the request-response cycle that we talked about back at the beginning of class. Essentially what's happening here is that when we visit the Days Links page, a request is sent to the server. The server sees that we're requesting the Days Links page. It executes that page, which involves creating the days variable and assigning it a value of 1. At that point, that program is then finished. That script is executed, it's done, its output is produced, that output is sent back to my browser, it shows up in my browser. When that output shows up in my browser, that script is done. It is finished. It has already, in the past, completed its execution, which means that the days variable that was created as part of the execution of that script no longer exists. When I then click the link that I see in my browser, which takes me over to the Lightspeed page, again, a request is sent to the server. The server finds the Lightspeed file that I've requested and executes it. And when it goes to execute it, there is no days variable. The days variable that was created on the previous page has long since stopped to exist, so there's no days variable for the light speed page to be able to use. Because of this disconnect, the fact that every time we make a separate request for a PHP page, it runs in its own space, in its own time, separate from every other PHP page that we request, we have to pay some special consideration into how we can get a value from one page to another. Simply declaring a variable on one page and then having that variable exist on another page in PHP fundamentally doesn't exist. There will later in the course be some roundabout ways we can simulate that general idea, but fundamentally that simply is not possible because of the way the request response cycle works. So let's take a look a little bit more in depth at the request response cycle, how these requests and responses are actually being generated and handled by the client and by the server, and see if we can't maybe find a clue there as to how we could get a value from one page to another. HTTP requests are the types of requests that are typically sent from web browsers to web servers. Let's take a look at how they work. The entire process begins with a client, most likely running a web browser. The user then goes and clicks on a hyperlink in that web browser. When the user clicks on a hyperlink, what actually happens is the web browser accesses the HTML code associated with the hyperlink, which probably looks a little bit something like this. A lot of this code that's here is actually just there for the benefit of the web browser, so that the web browser understands that this is a hyperlink, it knows where the hyperlink is supposed to lead, and it knows what text to represent it with in the user's actual view. The part of this code that's the most important as far as sending an HTTP request goes is simply the domain name and the path and file name that are actually being requested. With that information, what can happen is your web browser can then take it and can use it to form an HTTP request. In this particular case, the request would be a GET request, a type of HTTP request. The actual GET request itself is relatively simple. I think of it as being something like a postcard, nothing too in-depth, nothing too complicated about it. What the web browser does when it goes to form this GET request is it's able to see the domain name of the web server that the request is being made to. It also knows what exactly is being requested, the actual page that we're asking for. The web browser then also knows its own IP address, which it's able to add to the request. At that point, the request is ready and can be sent. When the request is actually sent, it of course is then received at the web server. The web server then in this HTTP request has all of the information that it needs to be able to respond to it. It knows the file that it's supposed to look up there in its local file system, possibly a script that it's meant to execute. It knows where to send that response to. So what the server can then do is it can access the file that's been requested, executing it if necessary, and start forming a response. The response, of course, will be sent to the client that sent the original request. The server knows its own domain name or its own IP address. It also then knows the output of the actual file lookup or script execution that takes place. All of that information together then forms the response, which the web server can then send back to the client. Now, with these different HTTP requests, there are different types. Like what I just described was a GET request. There are other types as well, POST requests being the second most common. And both of these types of HTTP requests are very important to web developers. The reason that they are important is that web applications do not run locally on a person's computer the way that a desktop application would. Instead, because a web application runs remotely on a web server, these HTTP requests become the primary way that the user, the client, is able to actually send information to the application and then be able to get back whatever output it is that they're expecting. So let's look at how this sending of data can work with GET requests. It starts off essentially just like with what we had before, the client. Again, running a web browser. The user can click on a link in the web browser. Again, that is associated with some HTML code. Of all that HTML code, stripping out the part that's relevant to the request, we end up with just this. You can see that what's different here than what we had before is that not only do we have a domain name, a path, and a file that are being requested, but there's also now additional information included in the link itself, and a URL parameter, which hopefully you've run into before in previous languages or through previous experience. What happens is that when the web browser now goes and puts together the GET request, it takes into account the fact that that URL parameter is there and sends it along with the name of the page or the file that's being requested. When all of the information for the request is put together and the request is actually sent to the web server, when it receives that request, now not only knows what file is being requested, but it also sees that URL parameters are available and turns those URL parameters into information that's now available for that script to use whenever it executes. So, when the server begins putting together the response, the server takes into account the data that was in the URL parameters and can use that data to customize the output that's generated. That output then, of course, in the response is sent back to the client again. So through the use of the URL parameters, the web server was able to customize how the actual script on the server was executed, providing a custom output to the client that made the request. The same thing can happen with the second most common type of request that happens in the web application space, and that's through post requests. Post requests most often come from web forms. GET requests are a little bit too simple to carry a lot of the information that we would want to put into a web form, so typically when a web form is submitted to a server, a post request is used instead. The overall process, though, is fairly similar. The user would fill out the web form, they would submit the web form, and again, just like previously when the user was clicking a hyperlink, there is a segment of HTML code that's associated with that form. A lot of the code that's actually making up that form is there essentially for the browser's use. If we strip all that out and just look at what's important as far as the HTTP request is concerned, we end up with just these pieces of data. What we actually have here is we have the name of the page that's being requested, we have what type of request is being made, we have the names of the different pieces of data that are being submitted, and from the form we have the actual data that the user filled in, which is then associated with those different field names. If we take all of that together in conjunction with the name of the website that we are making the request to, essentially the name of the website that provided the form, and the IP address of the client, all of that information together can then be used in order to be able to form a post request. A post request is a little bit more in depth than a GET request. I think of it as being a bit more like a letter in an envelope than like a postcard. The process, though, is overall pretty much the same. With all of the information that's gathered from the form, and knowing that it's supposed to send a post request, the browser can address the envelope so that it's going to go to the proper domain, the proper web server, and request the proper page. It knows who the post request is being sent from, what the return address is, and then all of the actual data that was collected from the form essentially becomes the content of the request that goes into the envelope. Once all of this information is put together into a proper post request, the post request should be ready to be sent, and it can be sent off then to the web server. Once the web server receives the post request, it will be able to extract all the necessary information from it. It'll be able to make use of the form data that was submitted and can then put together whatever response is appropriate to be sent back to the client. So, based on what we now know about the HTTP request and response cycle and how parameters can be passed either in GET or POST requests, that should give us a little bit of an idea of how we could potentially get a value for our number of days from one page to another. Let's just try a really simple example here and try it out. The same link that I was using before, where I was allowing the user to click a hyperlink to take us over to the Lightspeed page, let me take that same link and let me modify it by adding a URL parameter to it. After the relative URL for my Lightspeed page, I'm going to put a question mark, days equals, and then what I'd like to do right here is to put in the value of my actual days variable. I'm going to do that by putting in a set of PHP tags, and then right there I am going to echo the value of my days variable. So whatever the value of my days variable is should become a part of that URL. Let's take a look. If I jump back over to my browser and refresh, page looks fundamentally like it did before. If I look though at the actual code that was used to execute this page, or was used to render this page, I can see right here that the number of days that I have set, 1, right, is actually being parsed into the URL itself, becoming a part of the URL parameters, which means now that if I click on that hyperlink, that value will actually accompany the requested page, lightspeed.php, over to the server. If I actually go ahead and click the link, it takes me over to the Lightspeed page, and if I actually look up at my address bar, I can see up there the URL parameter that was sent to the server when the page was requested, but it hasn't fixed the fundamental problem. I'm still not seeing a days variable in existence over on my Lightspeed page. Let's see how we can fix that. If I go back to the code for my Lightspeed page, right, I still need a days variable. The question is, how do I get the value that was sent as part of the GET request for this script? How do I get that value so that I can actually use it in my script? What it comes down to is that PHP automatically gathers for me any parameters that are sent as part of the request. In this particular case, the parameter I'm interested in using was sent as a part of a GET request, so PHP puts together for me a special variable, $_get, G-E-T, all capital letters. That's then followed by a set of square braces. Inside those square braces, I can put in as a string the name of a parameter that I want to retrieve, days for example. Days that I'm putting here as a string inside the square braces with this get variable equates to days, which I made the name of my URL parameter in the actual hyperlink the user clicked. In the hyperlink, if I had called that number equals and then some value there, then over here I would say $_get, and then inside the square braces as a string I would put number. So what I'm doing here is I'm essentially saying, PHP, give me the value that was passed as part of the GET request called days, and put it here into my days variable. If I take a look at my script in the browser now, the errors all go away, and I am performing my calculation and getting the distance that light will travel in one day. So how could we then actually make use of this? Well, one thing I could do would be to set up a system here on my Days with Links page where the user could click on different hyperlinks that would allow them to fundamentally select different numbers of days. Why don't we try that in the next video?